Hello, and welcome to the first lesson of our literature course. In this video, I'm going to look at three different things. First off, we're going to have examinations, then we're going to have assessment objectives, and finally we're going to look at tragedy. So just like the history video I've done, I've split up our examinations into the first year and the second year. I understand again that some people aren't going to be taking the AS, but all of the stuff I'm going to be teaching is going to have a place in the A level, so don't worry. Paper 1, we look at two different texts, and paper 2, we also look at two different texts. They're worth half each, and they're both an hour and a half in length. Paper 1, we're looking at Death of the Salesman and Othello, and paper 2, we're looking at Keats and The Great Gatsby. So when you're writing these essays, you need to be thinking to get them done in about 45 minutes each. These exams are quite nice, I'll be honest. I think they give you a nice amount of time to write. Limiting to 2 texts per exam is good because they're quite similar, and in that sense you're in a certain state of mind before you start writing, and it's quite pleasant. Word of caution, Othello and Keats have extracts in their questions, so if you don't like extracts, you're not going to like those. Personally, I think Keats isn't that interesting. I think The Great Gatsby is my favourite, and Doas and Othello are really interesting. That's going to be totally up to you though. Moving on to A2, to the second year. Essentially, the stuff we're going to learn in this course is going to make up the entirety of paper 1. But there's a slight difference. So, rather than having one question per text, there is 2 questions just on Othello, and then there's 1 question on 2 more texts. When you transition from the AS year to the second year, you leave 1 text behind. So it might be an idea, if you're currently studying at AS, to suggest to a teacher which one you do want to leave behind, because it can be quite a good thing if you really struggle with a text to just get rid of it for the full A-level year. Then there's paper 2. You look at 3 new texts. This is a 3-hour exam. The last one was 2.5 hours. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the remaining exam because I'm not going to be able to teach it that well. But to give an example of some of the texts you might study, I'm studying William Blake's poetry, A Handmaid's Tale, and a contemporary book by Jim Crace called Harvest. If you do this spec, you'll probably share one with me, and I hope to maybe do videos on them in the future. There's also a bit of coursework, and this makes up the remaining 20%. The other 2 are worth 40% each. And again, I'm not going to go into it too much. There's 2 bits of coursework. So there's one on poetry and one on prose. I've done my poetry one on Sylvia Plath, but it's totally up to you. You can do on anything you want, within reason, obviously. Next up, we're going to look at the AOs. In English Literature Specification B for AQA, there are 5 assessment objectives. I've simplified them in 1 or 2 words. It might be worth going and reading it, but I find them incredibly complicated. They don't need to be that complicated, but they are. They all have different weightings. The ones with the biggest weightings are these 2. Lowest rating is this one. And so yeah, I'll start with AO1. That's all about your skill of written argument, how you present your ideas. If you're good at writing, you'll get good AO1 marks. If you're not so good at writing, unfortunately, it's really difficult to get good AO1 marks. This is literally like, in my opinion, it's all about your style. So if you have quite a good academic style, then this is really good. But if you don't, then you might want to try and change it up a bit. Next up, we're going to look at AO2. Here I've called it language and structure, but we don't look at language that much, which might come to a bit of a shock, come as a bit of a shock to people who are coming in from GCSE. My understanding is, at least when I did it, it was overwhelmingly language you look at GCSE, to the point where you wouldn't even consider structure. I did well at GCSE without looking at structure at all, so I assume that's still the way it is. Here we look at structure so much more than language. Language is, in my essays at least, it's a third, So I'll look at it in a third of my essay and then do the other 2/3 looking at structure. You need to get used to comparing acts and comparing chapters, and this gets you a whole lot of marks, so it's really worth looking into. AO3 is context, probably did it at GCSE. It's literally just who was the writer, when were they writing, who were they writing for, how did people react, that kind of stuff. You don't get a great deal of marks for it, but you do get awarded for it. AO4 is tragedy, or if you're doing the other strand, it's comedy. It's looking at this stuff, essentially. So I'll go into that a bit more, but it's understanding this stuff. Or obviously, if you do the comedy section, it's about understanding aspects of comedy. And AO5, finally, in your A-level year, it's about looking at Marxist, feminist, psychoanalytical perspectives. I will go on to that in a later video. It sounds really scary, but it's not. In fact, I find it much easier than some of the stuff we did at GCSE. Finally, this is the part of the video where if you're not doing the tragedy strand of the specification, you can turn off unless you're interested in this kind of stuff. Tragedy. Tragedy is not someone's dodgy haircut or their really bad outfit or a kid falling into a lake. It's got nothing to do with what you think tragedy is. It's all about a guy called Aristotle. He wrote 2,000 years ago in a book called Poetics, and he essentially outlines what a tragedy is in terms of stories. The most quintessential tragedy is Oedipus Rex, and that's a really weird story. It might be interesting to go and look it up, but it's about this guy and he has sex with his mum and pulls his eyes out. And the reason it's such a quintessential tragedy is because Aristotle essentially based his theory of tragedy on Oedipus Rex. So that's why they line up so well. Aristotle isn't this kind of god, like he liked a certain thing and that's what he wrote about, and that's why we have so much focus on Oedipus Rex. So one aspect of tragedy is anagnoresis. Now I'll warn you that these are all weird Greek words, so I might mess up the pronunciation, but I'll try my best. Anagnoresis is all about the movement from ignorance to knowledge, and it's not like learning maths or anything, it's learning about the reality of your situation. So if someone's been lying to you, it's about learning that they've been lying to you. Then we have this idea of the hero. The tragic hero is the centre of any Aristotelian tragedy. Othello is the centre of Othello. Kind of, the name gives it away. So he has certain characteristics, which I'll go on to later on, but he is a just man, he's a noble man, he's definitely not a woman, he has to be a man, because when Aristotle wrote, women weren't allowed out of the house. So he is this very grand figure, but he's going to undergo a downfall, and that is what tragedy is all about, a downfall of a great man. Peripeteia means turning point. It's when the story goes from looking one way to looking to another. It's quite simple, but if you use fancy words like this, people will think you're smart, so definitely use these words. Hubris is about pride, but it's not just being proud or being cocky or having an ego, it's thinking you're better than the will of the gods, which we might think now is a bit ridiculous because we live in a bit of a secular society, but when Aristotle wrote, the gods were very much part of daily life, and so to think one is above the gods is kind of this really bad sin, and that's something that a lot of tragic heroes do have wrong with them. Hubris is actually an example of hamartia. Hamartia means tragic flaw, so it's a characteristic of our hero which makes him susceptible to a downfall. With Othello, it's arguably his trust for Iago and his distrust of Desdemona. Every typical tragic hero has a hamartia, even when we look at Death of a Salesman, who a play which doesn't actually have a tragic hero, in my opinion. All of the characters essentially have hamartia in some way or another, so it's something that's very universal, not only in tragedy but also along storytelling and even humanity, I think. Finally, we have catharsis. You've probably heard this word before. It means the feeling that we get when the curtains close on the production and we look around us and we're deeply moved by what we've seen. We look at our place in the world and we look within ourselves to look at our personal flaws or whatever. It's all about the lasting effect at the end of a tragedy. I'd like to thank you for sitting through this video, and I hope it's been helpful in one way or another. Hope to see you next time.